Two security guards grabbed Walter Combs by the arms and dragged him down the center aisle of Millbrook Community Church, while 300 people in the main sanctuary watched and said nothing. The Sunday morning service had been smaller than usual, but the church still drew nearly 1,000 people a week across its multiple services and overflow rooms. His shoes scraped against the polished marble floor. His jacket, torn at the shoulder seam and gray with age, ripped further as one of the guards yanked him sideways toward the doors. Somewhere near the front, a woman in a cream blazer pulled her purse a little closer to her body, as if poverty were something you could catch by proximity. Pastor Daniel Ashford did not stop preaching. He stood at the pulpit in a charcoal suit that cost more than Walter would make in 2 months, watched the commotion out of the corner of his eye, and kept his voice smooth and warm, like he was narrating a nature documentary, instead of watching a man get thrown out of a building for the crime of looking poor in the wrong sanctuary. Sometimes, Daniel said into the microphone, the enemy sends distractions right into the house of God. But we don't let distractions steal our peace, do we, church? A ripple of amens went through the congregation. Somewhere in the back, sitting in the section reserved for members who couldn't afford the suggested kingdom partner tier, a woman named Maggie Hensley watched Walter get dragged past her row, and her stomach turned. She was 61 years old, and she had been coming to this church for 19 years, long before it had valet parking and a jumbotron, and a pastor who wore a different pair of leather shoes every single Sunday. She recognized Walter. He used to come every week, sit in the same spot, sing louder than anyone else in the building. He'd fallen on hard times 8 months ago, after losing his job at the plant. Nobody had checked on him since. The doors slammed shut behind him. The service continued like nothing had happened. Outside, in the parking lot, Walter Combs sat down on the curb because his legs had stopped wanting to hold him up. A younger man named Rick, who worked as a part-time janitor for the church and had seen the whole thing from the side entrance, jogged over and crouched next to him. "You okay, man?" Rick asked. Walter laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Been better. Been worse, too, if that helps. That was messed up in there. I'm sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for. Not your doing." Walter pushed himself up slowly, brushing dust off his torn jacket. "Used to sing in that choir, 10 years ago. Nobody remembers that part." Rick didn't say anything else. He just walked Walter to the bus stop 2 blocks away and waited with him until the bus came, because it was the only thing he could think to do, and because doing nothing had started to feel unbearable. If this story makes your blood pressure rise a little, that's exactly what it's supposed to do. So stick around, because it gets worse before it gets better. Hit subscribe now if you haven't already. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and let's get into it. Maggie didn't sleep well that night. She kept seeing Walter's face, the way his eyes had gone flat and resigned, like being humiliated in public was just one more indignity on a long list he'd stopped being surprised by. She thought about calling someone, but who would she call? The deacons answered to Daniel. The elder board answered to Daniel. Everyone in that building, one way or another, answered to Daniel Ashford. And Daniel Ashford answered to no one. 3 days later, her phone rang at 6 in the morning. It was her daughter, crying so hard the words barely came out. "Mom, it's Ethan. He collapsed at school. They think it's his heart. Mom, they're saying he needs surgery, and they're saying it's soon. And we don't have insurance that covers this kind of thing. We don't have..." Her daughter's voice broke apart entirely. Maggie's grandson was 11 years old. He liked dinosaurs and terrible jokes, and he called her every Sunday night just to tell her about his week, even when nothing interesting had happened. The hospital wanted $42,000 before they'd scheduled a procedure. Maggie had $1,100 in her checking account, and a paid-off house that was worth maybe $90,000 if she could sell it fast, which she couldn't, not fast enough. She thought of the church. 19 years of tithes. 19 years of casseroles for the sick and rides to appointments for the elderly. 19 years of showing up whether it rained or snowed or her knees ached too badly to kneel. She thought, if there's anywhere left in this world that owes me a little grace, it's there. She called the church office and asked for a meeting with Pastor Ashford. To her surprise, they gave her one, that same afternoon. Daniel's office looked like something out of a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows,
a leather chair that probably cost 4 figures, a framed photo of Daniel shaking hands with a state senator on the wall behind his desk. He stood when Maggie walked in, arms open, that camera-ready smile locking into place like a switch had been flipped. "Sister Maggie," he said, pulling her into a hug she didn't ask for. Sit. What's troubling your heart today?" She told him everything. Ethan's collapse, the surgery, the $42,000. Her voice cracked twice, and both times Daniel nodded with practiced sympathy, the way a man nods when he's already decided the conversation and is just waiting for his turn to talk. When she finished, he folded his hands on the desk and leaned forward. "Maggie, I want you to hear this with love," he said. "Sometimes when the enemy attacks a family, it's not random. Sometimes it's testing your faith to see what you'll sow into the kingdom even when it's hard."
Maggie blinked. "Pastor, I'm not asking for a loan. I'm asking if the church has a benevolence fund. Anything, even a little." "I hear you," Daniel said, holding up a hand. "But Maggie, real faith isn't asking what the church can give you. Real faith is what you're willing to give first. I'm going to challenge you today. I want you to sow a $500 seed. Prove to God and to yourself that you trust Him more than you trust your bank account. You do that, and watch what He does for your grandson." For a moment, Maggie thought she'd misheard him. $500? She repeated slowly. "Pastor, I have $1,100 to my name, and my grandson needs $42,000 for heart surgery. Then $500 is exactly the kind of sacrifice that moves the hand of God," Daniel said, smiling like he'd just handed her a gift instead of a demand. She left his office empty-handed, her hands shaking, her mind refusing to fully process what had just happened. Somewhere behind that closed office door, Daniel Ashford had already forgotten her name. 2 floors below, in a maintenance closet that had been converted into a supply room, a man named Tommy Bradley was hauling boxes of bottled water for Sunday service. Tommy was 29 years old, worked the overnight shift at a distribution warehouse 40 minutes away, and picked up landscaping jobs on Saturdays whenever he could get them. He'd been serving as an usher at Millbrook for 6 years, showing up early to set up chairs and staying late to stack them, never once weighing whether the church deserved that kind of loyalty. It was just what he did, the way he showed up for his shifts at the warehouse. 3 months earlier, Tommy had given the church $4,000, nearly every cent of his savings, after Pastor Ashford stood at the pulpit and described in painful detail how the church roof was failing, how water was seeping into the sanctuary, how without immediate repairs, the whole east wing might have to close. Tommy remembered the exact words. "This roof has carried the weight of this congregation's prayers for 30 years. Will you carry it now?" Tommy had gone home that night, looked at the number in his savings account, and transferred almost all of it before he could talk himself out of it. He never once looked up at the roof to check if it actually leaked. The Founders Gala was Millbrook's biggest night of the year, a black tie fundraiser held at a rented event hall downtown, where the church's top donors, the ones who gave enough to earn the title Kingdom Partner Platinum, sipped wine under crystal chandeliers while a string quartet played somewhere near the dessert table. Tommy worked that night too, along with a dozen other volunteers, carrying trays of champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres to tables full of people who spent more on their outfits that evening than Tommy made in a month. By 10 p.m., he'd been on his feet for 14 hours straight, having come off a warehouse shift that morning and gone directly to set up for the gala without sleeping. His hands were shaking. His vision kept tunneling at the edges. He told himself he could push through, the way he always pushed through, because that's what serving looked like. That's what faith looked like. He made it halfway across the ballroom floor with a tray of drinks before his knees buckled, and he went down hard, glasses shattering across the marble, wine soaking into his white dress shirt. The room went quiet. Then, from the head table, Daniel Ashford stood up, and for one brief second, Tommy thought, "Thank God, he's coming to help me." Instead, Daniel walked over, looked down at Tommy sprawled on the floor among broken glass, and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear it clearly, "Son, get up. This is what happens when your body becomes an idol. You worship more than your commitment to this house. If your faith were where it needed to be, you'd have the strength to finish your service." Nobody moved to help him. A few platinum donors actually laughed. Quiet, uncomfortable laughter.
The kind people do when they don't know what else to do with secondhand embarrassment. Tommy pushed himself up off the floor alone, wine dripping down his sleeve, humiliation burning harder than the exhaustion had. He finished his shift. He didn't say a word. He went home at 2 a.m, sat on the edge of his bed, and cried in a way he hadn't cried since he was a kid. He didn't quit. Not yet. Some part of him still believed that this was just a bad night, that the man at the pulpit every Sunday couldn't really be the same man who'd humiliated him on that ballroom floor.
The tier system at Millbrook wasn't written down anywhere official, but everyone who attended long enough learned the shape of it fast. Platinum donors had a private entrance, valet parking, and reserved seating at the front. Everyone else, the people who could not afford the larger pledge amounts, filled the overflow rooms, sitting on folding chairs in front of flat screens bolted to the wall. Walter Combs had been a paying member, back when he still had a job and could afford a small monthly pledge. When he lost the job, after his clothes started fraying and his car got repossessed and he started walking 2 miles each way to get to service, nobody lowered his dues, offered assistance, or asked how he was surviving. They simply stopped seeing him. Until the Sunday 2 security guards decided his appearance had crossed some invisible line and physically removed him in front of the entire congregation. Word about that spread through the poorer members quietly, in hushed conversations in the parking lot, in the overflow room before service started. Walter kept coming back anyway, further back now, near the exit, close enough to leave quickly if security decided once wasn't enough. Nobody said anything to Daniel directly. Nobody dared. Meanwhile, Daniel Ashford's problems were mounting in ways his congregation had no idea about. He'd purchased a second home in Naples, Florida, financed with a balloon mortgage about to reset at a rate his income could no longer cover. He'd also bought into a fractional jet share program, and the monthly payments were bleeding him dry. His financial advisor warned him that week that he was 3 missed payments away from losing the Naples house, and that the jet share company was threatening to void his contract altogether. Daniel sat behind his desk for a long time afterward, staring at the framed photo of himself shaking hands with a state senator, thinking not about his congregation, but about how it would feel to explain that loss to the other pastors at the conferences he attended every year. He needed money, fast, and he knew exactly which lever to pull to get it. The following Sunday, Daniel stood at the pulpit with an urgency in his voice the congregation hadn't heard before. He told them God had visited him in a dream 3 nights earlier. In the dream, he said, a shadow had passed over Millbrook Community Church, a shadow of death, and God had shown him that unless the congregation came together and gave an offering of $100,000 within 7 days, tragedy would fall on someone in this very room. I don't say this lightly, Daniel said, his voice trembling with what looked, to anyone watching, like genuine fear. I've been praying about whether to even share this with you, but I love you too much to stay silent while the enemy plans to take one of you from us. The room fell into stunned silence, then into the low murmur of 200 people quietly panicking. Somewhere in the overflow room, an elderly man started crying. A mother clutched her toddler a little tighter. A retired school teacher named Ruth grabbed her husband's hand and whispered, "What if it's one of us? What if it's one of the grandkids?" And her husband, who had never once questioned Daniel Ashford in 14 years of membership, found himself for the first time wondering whether a loving God really operated through countdown timers and cash deadlines. He pushed the thought away as fast as it came. It felt disloyal. It felt dangerous. Around him, other members were having some version of the same silent argument with themselves, and losing it the same way he was. And in the general seating section, Maggie Hensley sat frozen, her mind racing back to the office conversation from weeks earlier, back to the words, "prove your faith," back to her grandson who was still waiting on a surgery she hadn't been able to fully fund. Maggie didn't fully believe in prophetic dreams, not the way some of the older members did. But fear doesn't require belief to work. Fear only requires the possibility of loss. And Maggie had already lost so much peace of mind over Ethan that the idea of losing anything else, even a shadow of a threat, felt unbearable. That week, quietly, without telling her daughter, Maggie called a real estate agent about the small parcel of farmland her late husband had left her, 12 acres out past the county line that had been in his family for 3 generations. It wasn't worth much by market standards, but it was worth something, and something was more than nothing. She sold it in 5 days for $31,000, folded a cashier's check for $28,000 of it into an envelope, and dropped it into the offering plate the following Sunday without telling a single soul what it had cost her. Even after giving away nearly all of it, she would still be thousands short of Ethan's hospital bill. But Daniel had convinced her that the offering was the thing standing between her grandson and disaster, and that belief had outrun the math a long time ago. Stories like this are inspired by patterns that have happened in real communities, and if it makes you angry, that anger is appropriate. Drop a comment below with the angriest part of this story so far, and hit that like button before we keep going. Vanessa Cole had been Millbrook's choir director for 4 years, and for nearly 2 of those years, Daniel had trusted her with more of the church's inner workings than almost anyone else on staff. She had access to budget summaries and a handful of internal folders, though not the church's complete accounting system, and she'd sat in on meetings the general membership never knew happened. It took her a long time to admit that proximity to Daniel had made her part of what he was doing to people like Maggie and Tommy, not just a witness to it. In private, with a glass of wine in his hand and his tie loosened, Daniel liked to talk. He liked to talk about how easy it all was, how a well-timed dream or prophecy could refill the offering plate faster than any stewardship sermon, how people like Maggie Hensley would give away their last dollar if you just knew exactly which words to use. After months of hearing Daniel discuss church money as though it belonged to him, Vanessa had begun quietly recording their private conversations, not because she had a plan for what to do with them, but because she no longer trusted herself to remember everything clearly, and some part of her suspected she might need proof one day, even if she couldn't say proof of what. One evening, she set her phone on the counter with the camera recording before Daniel started talking. The video showed him leaning back on the sofa, relaxed, a glass of wine in his hand, grinning as he spoke. "You should have seen her face," he said. "Old lady sold her dead husband's land because I told her God sent me a dream. People will believe anything if you dress it up in scripture." He kept going. He talked about Tommy Bradley collapsing at the gala, laughed about it, called him weak, said the roof repair story had worked so well he was thinking about running it again the following spring, for a new fellowship hall that didn't actually need building. He talked about Walter Combs, called him an eyesore, said the security team should be quicker next time about clearing out anyone who might scare off platinum donors. Vanessa didn't say anything that night. She sat across from him, smiling when he wanted her to smile, refilling his glass when he wanted it refilled. But something in her had gone very cold and very still, and it wasn't going to warm back up. Tommy Bradley found out what happened to his $4,000 almost by accident. He was in the church's copy room one afternoon, printing bulletins for the following Sunday, when he noticed a manila folder left open on the counter. Invoices for roof repair work spilling out of it. Curious, and still nursing a wound from the gala that hadn't fully healed, he flipped through it. The invoices were dated from 8 months earlier. Total cost of the repair work, according to the paperwork, $2,200 for minor flashing repair around a single vent pipe. Nothing about a failing roof. Nothing about water damage threatening to close the east wing. The church had raised over $60,000 from the congregation for that emergency, including Tommy's $4,000. His hands went cold. He read the invoice 3 times, sure he was misunderstanding something. Sure there had to be another folder somewhere with the real numbers. There wasn't. He put the folder back exactly where he'd found it, walked out to his car, and sat behind the wheel for 45 minutes without turning the key, replaying every sermon, every plea, every moment Daniel Ashford had looked him dead in the eye and asked him to sacrifice more. He started paying closer attention after that. He noticed the invoices that never matched the sermons. He noticed how the general fund reports, when members occasionally asked to see them, were always somehow delayed, always somehow still being finalized by the accounting team. He noticed how Vanessa Cole had started avoiding eye contact with Daniel during rehearsals, how something between them had shifted from warmth into something tighter and colder. 3 weeks later, Vanessa found Tommy alone in the sanctuary after evening rehearsal, stacking hymnals. She'd been watching him for weeks, too, noticing the same quiet questions in his face that she recognized, because she'd been asking them herself for months. "You've been looking into things," she said quietly. Not a question. Tommy froze. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." She sat down in the front pew. exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with rehearsal. "I have something. I don't know what to do with it. I've been carrying it around for weeks, too scared to do anything. And every day I don't do something with it, I feel like I'm just as guilty as he is." She showed him the recording. Tommy watched Daniel's face on the small phone screen, heard his own name come out of the pastor's mouth, followed by a cruel laugh, heard Maggie Hensley's sacrifice reduced to a punchline about a gullible old woman. When the video ended, he put the phone face down. His hands were still shaking, but he was no longer thinking about whether Daniel could destroy him. He was thinking about how many other people had been deceived the same way, and about the folder of roof invoices sitting in his glove box that would back up every word on that recording. "We can't just sit on this," Tommy said. "I know," Vanessa said, "but if we go to the elder board, they'll bury it. They answer to him. They always have." "Then we don't go to the elder board," Tommy said slowly, an idea taking shape. "We go to everyone at once." Vanessa's hands were still shaking. "If we do this and it doesn't work, he'll destroy both of us. He'll say the video's fake. He'll say we're bitter. He'll say I'm a jealous woman making up lies. You know how good he is at turning a room." "I know," Tommy said, "but I gave that man $4,000 I didn't have because he told me the roof was falling in. I watched him call me weak while I was bleeding on a marble floor. I'm done being afraid of how good he is at turning a room." Vanessa looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's do it right." They spent the next several nights after rehearsal working out the details. The layout of the media booth, how long it would take Vanessa to reach the exit if things went wrong, what they'd say if anyone stopped them beforehand. Whatever happened to them individually, they agreed, the congregation deserved to see the truth in a way that couldn't be denied, spun, or buried. Vanessa still had administrative access to the media booth system, used for queuing worship slides onto the Jumbotron screens during service. Tommy still had his usher credentials, so nobody thought twice about him walking calmly through the halls before Sunday service with a laptop bag over his shoulder. It took them 9 days to get everything in place. They chose the Sunday of the next major offering push, the one where Daniel planned to announce a follow-up fundraising campaign, this time for a fictional new fellowship hall he'd already started teasing from the pulpit. The same strategy he'd used for the roof, this time aimed at an even larger offering. The sanctuary was packed for the special offering service, nearly 2,000 people between the main floor and the overflow rooms. Daniel stood at the pulpit in a new suit, hands raised, voice building toward the emotional crescendo he always hit right before asking for money. "This house has never turned its back on God's calling," he said, his voice swelling with practiced conviction. "And I believe with everything in me that when we step out in faith again..." The screens behind him flickered. For half a second, the congregation assumed it was a technical glitch, the kind that happened occasionally during live stream setups. Then Daniel's recorded voice filled the sanctuary through the sound system, unmistakably his own, unmistakably clear. "Old lady sold her dead husband's land because I told her God sent me a dream. People will believe anything if you dress it up in scripture." Daniel's face went white. He turned toward the screens as his own laughter, recorded and amplified, echoed through the room, where hundreds of people who had trusted him with their savings, their land, their last $500, sat frozen in their seats. The video kept playing. Tommy's name, Maggie's name, Walter's name, called an eyesore. The roof repair scheme, laid out in Daniel's own voice, describing exactly how easy it had been to fabricate an emergency and watch the money roll in. Somewhere in the general seating section, Maggie Hensley sat perfectly still, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears sliding silently down her face, not from sadness anymore, but from something closer to vindication, mixed with grief, for every dollar, every year, every ounce of trust she'd handed over. In the overflow room, a small cluster of members who remembered Walter Combs being dragged out by security started murmuring, then talking, then nearly shouting, the sound rising like a wave building toward shore. Daniel grabbed the pulpit microphone, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control of a room that had already slipped entirely out of his hands. This is a manipulation. This is an attack from the enemy. Don't let this..." Nobody was listening anymore. 2 platinum donors near the front stood up first, gathering their coats without a word, moving quickly toward the private exit.
already calculating how fast they could distance themselves publicly before their names got tied to a scandal. A local news reporter, tipped off anonymously 3 days earlier by an email that traced back to an account Vanessa had created and deleted within an hour, was already filming from the back row on her phone. By the time the video finished playing in full, more than half the congregation was on their feet. Some were crying, some were shouting questions Daniel had no real answers for. Security guards, the same ones who had dragged Walter Combs out of the building weeks earlier, stood near the doors, looking lost, unsure for the first time whether their job was to protect the pastor or get out of the way. An older man near the front, one of the founding members, who had been attending Millbrook since it was a single rented storefront 20 years earlier, stood up slowly and pointed a shaking finger at the stage. "You told my late wife her cancer came back because her giving wasn't strong enough," he shouted, his voice cracking with a rage that had clearly been buried for years. "You told her that to her face." Daniel opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For once in his life, he had no verse to reach for, no smooth transition, no rehearsed line of comfort dressed up as correction. He just stood there, gripping the edge of the pulpit, while more members stood up around the room, one after another, each with their own name to add to the list.
Daniel Ashford stood alone at the pulpit, in a suit that had cost more than most of his congregation's monthly rent. And for the first time in years, nobody in that building was looking at him with anything close to admiration. Near the back of the overflow room, Walter Combs sat perfectly still, watching the screen where, weeks earlier, a security guard's radio had crackled the order to remove him. He didn't shout or stand. He just watched, arms folded, until the video finished. And then he let out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding since the day they dragged him down that aisle. If you had been in that room, would you have spoken up? Tell me after the story. The fallout moved fast. Local news picked up the story within days, and the church's board of elders voted to suspend Daniel almost immediately. 2 of the largest donors issued public statements distancing themselves entirely, careful only to protect their own names. A financial crimes unit opened an investigation after Tommy Bradley and Vanessa Cole filed a formal complaint, supported by financial records Vanessa had quietly copied over the preceding months. The records showed donor funds moving through vague line items and related accounts before being used for a Florida home, a JetShare membership, and a downtown condo. A detective assigned to the case called Maggie Hensley personally to ask about the land sale. When he asked whether she was willing to give a formal statement and cooperate with the investigation, she paused for a long moment. "I want him to have to sit in a room," she finally said, "and hear, out loud, from someone in a position to actually stop him, that what he did was wrong. I've never gotten that. I'd like that more than the money back, if I'm honest, though I wouldn't say no to the money either." The detective was quiet for a moment. Then he told her she would get her chance. Within a month, an interim leadership group had taken over from the elder board, and an internal audit turned up liabilities far beyond anything the church's reserves could cover. Services stopped soon after, the board calling it temporary while the finances were sorted out. It never restarted. The building went up for sale a few months later to help cover a portion of the debts Daniel had left behind. Maggie Hensley never got her land back. That part of the story doesn't have a clean ending, and it wouldn't be honest to pretend otherwise. But 3 weeks after the church closed its doors, a group of about 30 former members, the ones who'd never had platinum seats, the ones who'd stood in overflow rooms on folding chairs, started meeting on Thursday evenings in the community room of the public library downtown. Walter Combs showed up to the second meeting, in the same torn jacket, and nobody so much as glanced at it. Someone had brought a slow cooker full of chili. Someone else brought paper plates and a stack of secondhand folding chairs from their garage. Maggie sat next to Tommy, who told her, quietly, almost apologetically, that he'd found the roof invoices, that he was the one who'd helped Vanessa get the recording out. Maggie didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached over and squeezed his hand. "You did the right thing," she said. "That's more than most people would have." Her grandson Ethan, it turned out, had gotten his surgery after all, funded through a mix of charity assistance, a neighborhood fundraiser, and a GoFundMe boosted by the local news coverage of the scandal. He was recovering well. He still called his grandmother every Sunday night. And now, when he called, she had somewhere warm and honest to go afterward, instead of an empty house,
and a sermon replaying in her head about seeds and sacrifice. Vanessa started coming to the Thursday meetings too, hesitant at first, unsure whether she'd be welcome after everything, unsure whether the people she'd helped Daniel deceive would ever be able to look at her without flinching. Maggie was the one who pulled out a chair for her at the second meeting and told her, plainly, that walking away from something you helped build takes more courage than most people ever have to find, and that courage counted for something in that room. Vanessa cried harder that night than she had in months, and nobody made her explain why. Nobody in that library community room wore a suit that cost more than a mortgage payment. Nobody had a private entrance, or a jumbotron, or a security team ready to drag out anyone who didn't look wealthy enough. What they had instead was simpler, and it turned out sturdier. They showed up for each other, week after week, with nothing to prove and nothing to gain except each other's company.
Tommy went back to his warehouse job and his weekend landscaping shifts, same as before. Except now, when he finished a long shift, he had somewhere to go that didn't require proving anything to anyone. Daniel Ashford, last anyone in Millbrook heard, was still awaiting trial. His Florida vacation home already lost to foreclosure. His JetShare membership canceled months earlier. His name searchable now for exactly the reasons he'd spent a decade building an image to avoid. Real faith, real community. None of it needed a marble floor or a private entrance to be genuine. It just needed a folding chair, a slow cooker of chili, and people willing to tell the truth even when it cost them everything. Somewhere out past the county line, the 12 acres Maggie's husband had left her now belonged to a young couple building their first home. People Maggie had never met and never would. She knew nothing could make the land sale right. But when Ethan ran through her backyard, heart fully mended, asking her for the 100th time to tell him the dinosaur joke he already knew the ending to, she understood that Daniel had not been allowed to take everything from her. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story moved you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment below telling me what part hit you hardest, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way into the light eventually. See you in the next story.